Yes, welcome. This is F a Rap Critic. I'm your boy Malik 16, and no, I don't need a break. We just came off of a break, and I'd like to thank each and every one of y'all out there for allowing that to be possible. We don't do it too often, but had to put the full album review episodes on a slight little pause for the holidays, slipped in, had a little Christmassy New Year episode in preparation for April Walker's birthday. And yeah, just to wrap things up nicely. But the critical clips have been holding things down. Thank all of you who rock with those. It's gotten kind of controversial, so I definitely promote and encourage the discourse y'all been having in the comments. If anybody has feedback for me, some of y'all been correcting each other. Some of y'all been kind of, retorting against things that you think I said in the little clips, but it's all welcome. Just be respectful of each other, of me, and of yourself, man. Learn your history before you comment. It's always a good suggestion. And yeah, shout out to people who pop in periodically, but most importantly to all of you who have subscribed to the channel, got that notification bell turned on. And if you have not already, take a moment now to like and subscribe to the channel. Tell a friend to tell a friend. We are still speaking to this global hip-hop community, which is why the channel exists, along with its accompanying website, theraproller.com. I created the system so you all, the people, can determine on different levels just why classics are classics and how classic they are, because not all classics are created equally. And to set things off for the new year, I couldn't think of a better classic than the one we're talking about today, because this will be the first album reviewed on this channel that hit the 40-year mark. This album turns 40 years old later in the year. We're talking about none other than the classic by the legendary trio Whodini, Escape. This is category 1, where we go over the product, the album itself, a little background on this album. It was released on Jive Records in the fall of 1984. It is the sophomore release from this group. And with no further ado, we're going to get into it. The first dimension that we talk about in category 1 is dimension 1, the quality of the production. All right. Fun fact, you'll see in one of the clips that I mentioned working with the producer on this album and not appreciating it when I was a young child rapper. And we talk about the legend. Got to take a moment to acknowledge the legend, musical genius himself, Larry Smith, the late great. Shout out to him and his fam. He is the man behind the boards on this entire album, which is a shift from who the group was working with for their debut. Similar to the debut, this entire album was recorded in Europe. It was recorded in London in 16 days, which is really impressive. But they worked exclusively with a European producer from the electro scene out there on the first album. This time, this was kind of their attempt, especially from group member Jalil, to have a more organic relationship with the producer who understood the New York sound, the American hip-hop sound. And originally, it's written that this album was intended to go for a rock rap feel, which was the trend popularized by groups like Run DMC and the Beastie Boys, which makes sense because Whodini was at the time managed by none other than Russell Simmons himself. And so they were going for that same feel, but bringing on Larry Smith because the label didn't provide a producer. They couldn't get the same person. They didn't necessarily want to work with the same person, Connie, from the first album, but nobody was provided. Jalil happened to have a relationship with Larry Smith from the club scene and just from the streets in New York, and didn't even consider him until he bumped into him and was like, hey, let's make this work. And the story goes that Larry rejected it at first, but then needed the money for a friend and was like, I'll do it. Came out to Europe, manned the boards on the whole thing, and this 8-track album was born. In true 80s fashion, you're going to get the state-of-the-art machinery of the day, stuff that was popularized, but you're not hearing the ASR, but what you are going to get is the Roland TR-707 and the Lindrum machine. And then, of course, there's going to be Fender jazz bass and lots of synths going on. We're talking 1984, right? We're talking hip hop coming out of the sampling disco songs era and dabbling with this hard rock, classic rock feel and making these mashup hybrid sounds. Somewhere in between that, Whodini is credited with popularizing a more R&B sensibility, like rhythm and blues hip hop. Before that was even a wave, they created that lane for themselves, which allowed them to stand out a little bit. And it's probably good fate and good fortune that they took that turn, because the label was asking, and I'm sure Russell's influence, they were asking for that rock mashup feel to be in competition. So what winds up happening, you get beats on there that sound more like stuff off the Ghostbusters soundtrack, right? Deep bass lines, funky bass lines with ahead of its time kind of electronic synthesizer, even vocoder kind of stuff, right? You think about the sounds and the robotic talking on We Are Whodini, which closes the album out, and 5 Minutes of Funk. And it's like, okay, that's a little, Zapp and Roger influence in hip hop, and no one else was doing it at the time. So the funk bass lines permeate all throughout the album, and you still get traditional stuff. You're still gonna get those boom bap quintessential bare bones beats. Like you think of a track like Big Mouth, where it's just the bass line and the hard drum hits, and the boom boom tap boom boom tap tap. That's it. That is the entire beat. Not a lot of changes at all, and you can get away with that in 1984 because hip hop was still young. Whodini is one of the first acts to record full releases that got mainstream recognition. So taking that into consideration, one producer giving you a range of different sounds, because nothing sounds like 5 Minutes of Funk on here. Let me also point out how 5 Minutes of Funk sounds like a thunderstorm. There's effects in that song. It's not just this funky bass line. That decision to do that is iconic. It's become iconic. It's wow. You really feel like you're in a concert when you're listening to that song. The way it was mastered and engineered, chef's kiss. Shout out to everybody involved in that. When you throw in a track like Big Mouth and Friends, you're getting variety. The diversity comes from the different tones of synthesizers used, the different styles of synthesizing, the way the keyboards and synthesizers sprinkled throughout a track like Friends. You get a different emotion from it. And then when the synthesizer enhancements over the bass line goes, you're adding depth to something that sounds basic, right? The bass line itself is basic. Boom, 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 boom. But when you add that background melody, it's almost like a harmony. And then you got the nerve to put the sprinkly synth. The 80s was fascinated with robotic stuff, and so they didn't run the risk of playing it out. The differences in bass lines, like Escape is downright funk. That could have been an R&B song with that bass line. What's separating that from Rockwell's Somebody's Watching Me, right? It's just quintessential 80s funk, and what they're doing is making it pure hip hop by the drums and the pacing of it. Every song on here is pretty fast paced. BPMs, you can look that up if you're a super music nerd and you're into that stuff, but you're not getting any slowed down tracks here. The pacing remains elevated from the time that the second track comes on all the way through. 5 Minutes of Funk might be the slowest song on here. Now, of course, there's two instrumental cuts, which was the lay of the day. It was typical on 80s albums, especially hip hop albums, to have your, okay, this is the DJ's track, where not much really happens. There's some vocal snippets and samples and little scratches, but as I pointed out on the Eric B. and Rakim album, those tend to fill up space as songs, but it's really letting the beat ride and then periodic chops and vocal ad-libs. And that's what happens on the third track featuring Grandmaster D, which is just the instrumental to 5 Minutes of Funk. ultimate cheat code. And then, of course, Out of Control. But the difference here is that Out of Control has these voiceover moments where the rap members of the group are speaking to each other. So yeah, that exists, but they still add to the sonicScape because the pace never slows down. It's made for dance floors, it's made for party, it's made for radio. Factor in that Larry Smith was playing live instrumentation, like there was a bass guitar present on top of all of the drum machine and all of the 80s synthesizer stuff going on from the keys and the boards. There's still a large musicality here. And so this is all something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 2, where we talk about the cohesiveness of the sonic bed, right? So if we got this range, there's only 8 songs. The question is, how well does it fit together? We're talking about one producer, and Larry was a taskmaster, pushing them to bring their best out, making them do stuff over, redoing the sounds, and adding texture to things. And in my experience working with Larry, he might have been softer on us because he was older and we were kids, but he was no pushover. He was definitely giving us instruction. And so thinking about how this all flows together, if we talk about the pace never slows up, it maintains this constant groove setting, and then it starts with the robotic voice song, 5 Minutes of Funk, and it ends with the robotic voice song, We Are Whodini. There's a loose knitting that happens that threads it all together. And that's interesting because it allows you to go to spaces like Friends and Big Mouth, which are more boom bap, and Escape, the title track, which is more funk in nature, and have that room to play with because it's all tied together by the time you get to the end. In the vast pantheon of cohesive albums, this might be one of the most because of how much it doesn't waver. It's not here to take you on experimental trips. The whole album, production-wise, is experimental because they were creating a new lane for hip-hop. And so there's no need to be individually experimental, even though there is identity to each of the tracks on their own. But in the bigger picture, they all fit nicely into this newness, right? It's synth, it's R&B, funk bass, and it's danceable tempo. That's your cohesiveness there. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 3, where we think about the intentional mood and tone on this album. All right, so the album is called Escape. Keep in mind, the first album was called Whodini. It was self-titled, and their first single is called Magic Swan. So it's this campy, punny play off of the name Whodini in their dedication to Mr. Magic, which put them on the map. It's like perfectly formulaic. Second album, we're gonna play off of that name again, Escape. It might go over the heads if you're not really thinking about it, but it's fine because it's simple enough that can fit any definition, Escape. And when they do the title track, they are talking about escape from everyday things, the mundane, the monotonous, the annoying, the irritating, the everyday struggle, as Biggie put it, right? And they don't play off of Harry Houdini the magician, so it's there. It just fits because it fits. If their name wasn't Whodini, the Escape title still works. It's just like bonus. It's a cherry on top that it's a play off of their name. And they keep that theme not so tightly where every song is connected to it, but they revisit it at least 2 main points in the album where you understand why that's the title, right? So on the song Out of Control, which is not much of a song because again, it's one of those instrumental tracks that highlight the DJ, not a lot of scratching, but instead what happens is this voiceover moment that's chopped up in the middle and near the end of the song with the 2 rap members, Jalil and Ecstasy, speaking to each other. And you can assign that to any context you want because it's not given context except for this idea of escape, right? You can imagine this is speaking like a jailbreak out or runaway slaves if you want. But the idea is they're like, hey, I'm trying to get out of here. Why are you distracting me? And he's like, well, yeah, I'm trying to leave too. And he's like, well, which way do we go? And the other one is like, does it matter? And he's like, yeah, because I ain't trying to run over you. So it's this every man for himself kind of idea of trying to get out of something. And that is the entire theme. And it's put up like abstract art, but in the most simplistic way. And I say abstract art because only in the sense that take from this what you want and apply it to you. But it's not abstract in nature. It's a simple concept. Hey, if you want to get away from something that is causing you unhappiness, here's your chance. Let's dance. That's the whole theme of the album, right? So they don't get into that explicitly on separate tracks, but the fact that they're talking about things like friendship and talking about things like getting away from their 9-to-5 job or getting away from gossiping people, you get this overall feeling of it's time to shed your cares away. You don't have to be beholden to the stuff that's weighing you down. Break out, escape. That's the theme. They're not here to prove anything. They're not here to settle a score from the first album. They're not here to crown themselves the kings of rap. They're here to put suckers in their place. That comes up often. But the biggest theme is freedom. And let me know if you take anything else from this thematically, mood and tone. It's, again, singles oriented, geared to make you move, whether it's at a concert, at a club, in your car, on the radio. It's not a sit still type album. So all of those things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when we're thinking about the intentional mood and tone on this album. That takes us to dimension 4, the song distinction versus the repetition of words and sounds. We already talked about the expected repetition that comes from using mostly synths and funk bass on this album, which is a short album. And so, yeah, of course, there's going to be some things that are repeated. Does Escape and Out of Control and The Freaks Come Out at Night sound like they were all created in the same lab? Absolutely. But do they all have strong enough characteristics on their own to sound like independent songs? And the answer is yes, they do. It's debatable if any of this becomes sluggish because of the similar instrumentation, because the melodies are so different, the patterns are so different, what the rappers do over it becomes so different, and that takes us into the words. All right, for 80s dialect and lexicon, this group is not very limited in their word choices. It is really, really impressive when you think about how simplistic early 80s rap was, and that most of those pioneers did not run out of words. They did not start repeating the same things so much. I found more repetition on Eric B. and Rakim's Paid in Full, or something like Critical Beatdown by the Ultramagnetic MCs, because there's so much of this fallback on safe phrases. MC, or spelling your name every 5 minutes. And some of it is expected repetition. Surprisingly, those rappers behind those albums who have gone down in history as being lyricists and named as lyricists, where Whodini often gets overlooked. What was really common for rappers at the time, saying your name a lot. But I will say you will hear that more from rapper Jalil than Ecstasy. Ecstasy doesn't really say his name a lot throughout this album. Jalil says his name almost every other song, and that is where the repetition really begins and ends. You don't hear them saying a lot of the same things because they're not talking about a lot of the same things. Every track is about something different, which we'll talk about in a minute more in depth. So they're not addressing the same audience or the same individuals each time. You might hear dance, you might hear rhymes. It's really, there's really not a lot of word repetition here or phrasing. This is not the era of rep in your hood. They're not Brooklyn to death at all. surprisingly, for a Brooklyn act. And in an era where putting your part of the world on the map, where, let's be honest, this is New York, right? Early 80s. Putting your part of New York on the map was everything. That's not what this album is about. It's for everyone in their space to enjoy. And so, not a lot of repetition of words. Sounds wise, the repetition here is only functional, not in any kind of over abused way. But that's something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 5. The amount of content versus the amount of songs. I just mentioned every track featuring rap lyrics on this album is about something different, with the exception of 5 Minutes of Funk and We Are Whodini, which you could even argue those are about something different. They're only similar in the idea of braggadocio, but We Are Whodini is rapping about the group, whereas 5 Minutes of Funk are each of the performers rapping about themselves in the vein of you enjoying the party and the show that they're trying to put on for you. Really interesting distinction there, because if we go through the other 4 songs, because keep in mind there's only 6 tracks featuring rap lyrics. The other 2 of those, Grandmaster D, instrumentals, Out of Control, and featuring Grandmaster D. So then that leaves you with Escape, Big Mouth, The Freaks Come Out at Night, and Friends. And without me having to describe each of those songs, you can tell from the titles that they're all about something different. The group understands the assignment for each of those songs. They don't deviate from those topic points at all to start talking about other things. Those tracks contain verses that are about the topic at hand. And so if we're looking at 8 tracks, 2 of them being instrumental, 2 of them being braggadocio of 2 different kinds, and 4 being super topical and super focused on that topic, that is an album that's giving you the kind of range that a hip-hop purist could only hope for from most, if not every, hip-hop album. This is always a question of ratio, and this is something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. Takes us to dimension 6, the features. I love doing 80s albums because when we get to this dimension, it is almost never relevant. We are not in the era of where having someone else on your album is even in heavy consideration. There's an album by Curtis Blow around this time period that featured Run DMC, and it's just such a big deal that he would have other popular rappers on his album when he was a popular rapper himself. And to think of the idea that he said he was encouraged to have them on the album as a way of staying connected to the youth. To think that in 1984, 85, Curtis Blow was already a veteran, an older rapper who had to get with the youngins is wild to me. But that shows you how uncommon, how unorthodox that was for its time, because everyone's still trying to plant their flag, stake their claim, and fight the powers that be at the time to recognize that hip-hop is not a fad. It's going to be around, while, keep in mind, 50% of the rappers out there didn't even know whether or not it really was not going to stay a fad and remain a thing that grew and evolved. So, wow, yeah, having someone else cut the check with you and take a piece of your budget and money to be on a song where you're trying to make your name, rep your section of New York, because let's again, back to this idea that hip-hop was very New York centric at that time, and we didn't even know that rap existed outside of there. That is why you're not going to see features. And so it's up to you to determine if that is make or break for the album on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. If it doesn't affect it in any way, go ahead and give that bad boy a 5. If you feel like it brings it down, then anything lower. All right, that takes us to dimension 7, the question of, does the weakest song or do the weakest songs bring the album down in any way? Now, if you've been watching the critical clips, you've seen that there's a lot of varying opinions on whether a classic can be dented or ruined at all by one song. Brandon LSK does not believe so. When I had him on here for the Souls of Mischief album, he was like, how can one song bring an album down? Clint Coley certainly doesn't believe it. He said that was a stupid idea. He hates this dimension. How can one song stop something from being a classic? And a lot of you felt that way in the comments. But as anyone who grew up on magazine hip-hop journalism can tell you, lots of albums lost that big classic stamp of approval from the journalists because of one track that sounded out of place, that killed the cohesion. So it counts depending on your ears or what scale you're looking at it from. And that's why this scale includes this dimension. And we usually all could point to an album where we wish one track was off. If any of you grew up in the era of making your own mixes or your own CD burnt versions of albums and you left the song off, then you understand what I'm talking about. So on this album, it's so tightly packed, it's so short, it's so cohesive. You'd be hard pressed to find the weak link, but I'm sure you can. If you don't like the hook on something, right? You think about Escape with its sung hook. Escape, I gotta get away, I need a break. Maybe that's too corny. It just did not survive the test of time for you because it also, like I mentioned, sounds like it could have been on the Ghostbusters soundtrack. It's a very R&B funk remnant and holdover from the disco era type feel on that track. If you don't like the two Grandmaster D spotlight cuts, which don't have any rapping on it, that could be a takeaway for you. You might feel like, man, this just should have been a 6-song album and I would have been great with it. Maybe Big Mouth is too stripped down for you and you're like, this song goes on too long for this beat to be so simple. Maybe. All those things are things for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 and decide. If it has no impact at all, again, get that bad boy a 5. If you feel like, yeah, some of this takes away, anything less than a 5. All right, that takes us to Dimension 8, Mass Appeal. 1984, your biggest rap acts at the time were the newly emerging Run DMC, the remaining influence of Grandmaster Flash and Furious 5, which by then had broken off, where Melly Mel had his own Furious 5, and then of course Curtis Blow, the Fat Boys, of course, who were in movies. That's how big and popular they were, no pun intended. Rest in peace, Buffy and Prince Marky D, and a couple other people with some hit singles. LL Cool J was just about to come out, and so was Salt and Pepper. This is the very early rap scene. Whodini became one of the main groups mentioned. Hip-hop was in search of as many luminaries as possible, and Whodini fit that to a T. They were hip-hop luminaries. They're fighting the sophomore jinx, and they came out swinging. This is the album that gave them their first bona fide, officiated hits, whereas Magic's Wand could be considered, okay, this is a promo song for Mr. Magic. It's also an easy way to ensure that you get mixed show play, right? This is back when hip-hop was relegated to only being played late night on the mixed shows. Mr. Magic was the hottest ticket in town. And then the other follow-up single they had from their debut was a Halloween song, which could be considered campy, corny. Rap itself had an overall corniness to it. They're allowing songs like The Ha by Rappin' Duke to come out, and a couple years later, Will Smith is gonna do Nightmare on My Street. Dana Dane's gonna do a song called Nightmare, and Cinderfella. Like, you're able to do these corny type songs because rap itself is new. So it's like, oh, it's topical, it's a story, it's a fairy tale. You can do that and get away with it. We know hip hop thrives off an urban audience though. What was not considered corny a year ago might be considered corny by next year. But overall, there was some leeway here because of how young rap was. Now, what that does, they were safe from the scrutiny, but maybe not solidified and certified by the urban audience. So to come out on their next album with bangers that are not attached to any specific thing, they don't need anything, they're proving they are Whodini and they can independently make these hit singles. 5 Minutes of Funk is not attached to any moment, any holiday, any person. It's 5 Minutes of Funk. The Freaks Come Out at Night is not attached to anything. It's just a statement about New York, but because they don't say New York specifically, it applies to nightlife in general. So it's going to speak to anyone within that age range that's still going out and enjoying the night scene. And there you go. Now you top that with continued singles in the form of Big Mouth, Friends, and Escape. They checked all the boxes, they hit all the marks, and it was just hit after hit after hit. This album goes platinum. They are now verified, qualified, certified, and official in the eyes of the streets, in the eyes of radio, in the eyes of the industry. Whodini is a name that I heard ringing all throughout my childhood in the 80s, and they were usually paired with Run DMC because they were the other contemporaries, even though they weren't as big of crossover darlings as Run DMC because they didn't go the rock route. Remember, Run DMC, once they did Walk This Way with Aerosmith, they were forever MTV darlings until their star faded a little bit in the mainstream. But Whodini was right behind them, unless you count the Beastie Boys. But as far as traditional hip hop groups, I'll say this is what shot Whodini to fame, to the point where when anyone says freaks or is talking about nightlife activity, Freaks at Night is still a phrase or even a song that people bust out into singing to characterize how seedy and wild the nighttime could get, or how people act when the sun goes down. There hasn't been a song that topped that illustration of how that happens better yet. Okay, Friends, no one's made a song about this subject matter in that same way, where it's just open and accessible to everyone. It reminds me of The Breaks by Curtis Blow. When you're speaking, and this is something that hip hop lost, when you're speaking in universalities, it doesn't exclude and it leaves it open for other people to enjoy, as many people as possible to enjoy. That in itself is the mass appeal formula. In the first verse of Escape, Jalil gives you so many different facets of everyday stress that it's relatable, even if you're not in that position. We know what happens from these songs. These songs all got radio play. They all got video treatment, if I am not mistaken, except for 5 Minutes of Funk. Ironically, 5 Minutes of Funk does not get an official video, but it becomes the Grandmaster D version, the instrumental, right, featuring Grandmaster D, becomes the theme song for the first hip-hop centered video channel that was for the people, because MTV was still very limited and restricted because it itself was new. Its focus was on rock and pop. It started squeezing in Run DMC and other rap acts slowly as we hit the golden era. But for this point in time, Video Music Box was the hottest ticket in town if you lived in the New York tri-state area. I feel slightly bad for those of you who did not have that privilege, but you know, as I'm doing this channel more and more, I'm learning that other cities and areas had their own version. Brandon highlighted Oakland's Soul Beat and things like that. So yeah, for this to become the official theme song, Video Music Box, throughout the 80s, I don't think they changed it until like mid 90s, and that was the marker. Every time I heard that, I knew it was time to break out the vice grip, click the UHF channels, the top knob on your analog TV, and lock in for an hour or a half hour and just enjoy some stuff. But this is your quintessential hip-hop classic album, where almost every song is a single and is memorable because they all have their own life in different branches. Escape being the least known single from this album, but it's the title track. You can get away with that, and then Big Mouth would be second in line, and then you would go to 5 Minutes of Funk, and then the two biggest singles being Friends and The Freaks Come Out at Night. All right, platinum in the 80s, 1984 for hip hop. Crazy. Something for you to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 9, the 3 eyes impact, innovation, influence. All right. I mentioned how 5 Minutes of Funk, or featuring Grandmaster D, the instrumental version of that song, became the theme song for Video Music Box all throughout the 80s into the 90s. Other things that remain, I mentioned how The Freaks Come Out at Night is now a phrase or a common reference for nighttime activity, and Friends is the standard song for talking about that very topic. When we think about hip hop tracks or even music in general, it is a music classic all around, a pop culture classic. We know famously that Friends was sampled for Nas's If I Ruled the World, to the point where I don't even know if half the people who listen to that song know that that beat comes from that song. But you would hope so. You would hope so. 5 Minutes of Funk has been repurposed a few times by a few different people. Speaking of Nas, The Firm redid that song. It's 5 Minutes to Flush on their album in 1997. And out here in the Bay, a rapper, one of my, favorite Oakland rappers, Ezell, Can't See Well, did a variation of this on his track, 5 Minutes of Funktown, and killed it. It's like a cult classic out here. Yeah, I'm still fascinated. And we're talking about their similarities to Run DMC. Big Mouth is an analog to Run DMC's You Talk Too Much, which they're only separated by a year apart. But those songs, I remember being teased by my cousin using those songs, right? You talk too much, homeboy, you never shut up, or you got a big mouth, big mouth. The impact, like I said, this album becomes the album that solidifies Whodini as just top rap acts throughout the rest of the 80s till we hit that golden era. It also sets a precedent. We're going platinum now, baby. We're not just going gold, we're going platinum. We're getting every track played on the radio and getting the video treatment. Budgets are open now. Now we're looking at rap stars, not just rap performers. We're looking at the idea of being rap superstars. They go on the first Fresh Fest, which leads to the second Fresh Fest, which is one of the most iconic and talked about rap concerts in history, because it was one of the first successful major rap tours that proved that rap is viable. It's a commodity. It's safe enough to sell out stadiums. We talked about innovation, them opening up the lane for more R&B influenced hip hop, not disco, not rock, R&B. And some journalists have written that this set the precedent and laid the groundwork for New Jack Swing to come right after, a few years after, with Teddy Riley's influence. And Teddy Riley, of course, because he played with synthesizers and funk grooves, he used the keytar, he used the bass, the electro bass. It makes sense when you think about some of his early production, like The Show and the Classical 2 joint. Cool. It's not super far-fetched. Not the quickest connection I would have made, but not super far-fetched. And then fashion-wise, when you look at Ecstasy, I had the pleasure of meeting when I was recording with Larry Smith, same time I met Rev Run, and he wore the trademark Zorro hat. And I always thought it was unique and cool how no one else tried to ride that wave. The fisherman hats, the bucket hats, we saw a lot of people rock Kangos, even though you had the Kango Kid, who, let me point out how much Whodini does not get his credit for being such a nucleus of 80s hip hop. When we talk about the branches of the tree, we have to think about the fact that Whodini sits right here in the middle. They're managed by Russell Simmons. We all know how many acts in hip hop Russell Simmons is connected to. So that's an automatic connection with Run DMC. Run is featured in the Big Mouth video. That's how closely tied in they are. So they have the benefits of this Def Jam flow before Def Jam even really gets off the ground. But they're in there. They're in that same family. Along with them on their tour, they're bringing 2 members of UTFO as background dancers, including the Kango Kid. And that's just before they drop their hit debut and become notable rap acts on their own. So they put UTFO on in some way. Another dancer featured that Whodini gave a start to is Jermaine Dupri. And you'll see him in the Freaks Come Out at Night video. You'll also see UTFO in the Freaks Come Out at Night video. Official dancers on stage, but you'll see Jermaine Dupri doing a little pop and lock outside the tour bus in the concert footage. And, you know, he went on to dance with them for a couple years as he grew up. And then they're connected to Larry Smith. They came in praising Mr. Magic, which connects them with the Juice Crew without riding the Juice Crew tails, because the Juice Crew wasn't fully formed yet. But it's like, how ironic that they put UTFO on. You get into a legendary beef with the first rap member of the Juice Crew, Roxanne Shante. It's just a great study in rap genealogy, family tree stuff, if you want to look into it. But they need their flowers for that. Shout out to Grandmaster D and rapper Jalil, the surviving members. But when I met Ecstasy and he had the Zorro hat, I'm like, yo, he really rocks this. And I always liked, as a kid, rappers who seemed like characters. So like Kumo D and Ecstasy stood out because they could have been superheroes as far as I was concerned. My young impressionable mind, they were like larger than life figures. They had a costume, and that became his trademark. No one tried to copy that. The Zorro hat was his, and I'm just blown away. They also don't get enough credit for being one of the first bona fide Brooklyn acts to get on the hip hop scene in the early 80s. And we often hear the tales of the Bronx and Queens, the Bronx and Queens all throughout the beginning of hip hop, even Harlem sprinkled throughout, but rarely Brooklyn until the golden era. And so for Whodini to be that first Brooklyn group that really put the flag on the map but weren't repping it, it's amazing. Again, as a New Yorker, here in Brooklyn, people be not loud about Brooklyn as they could be is rare, and it's really interesting. And let me not fail to mention that the Freaks Come Out at Night was considered risque for its time. And us who have lived to see what hip-hop has become since 1984 would smirk or straight bust out in laughter at an assertion like that. But if we think about the tried and true adage that controversy sells or sex itself sells, then a song like The Freaks Come Out at Night was just edgy enough to push the buttons of what had been done or not been done prior to it, and safe enough to still get radio play because of the fun repetition of the hook, the catchiness of it, and the relatability of how they're describing what they're describing. You know, in Jalil's verse, there's more of a focus on the appearance of freaks. You get the idea that he was speaking about the punk night scene, the culture out there. He said they got spikes, but Ecstasy is focused on more of like the sexual exchange portion, scandalous and you know, lusty elements there. But to think of that being like ooh, how could they say that record of the day? And you look at some of the write-ups pointing at that out, it piqued interest and curiosity. And if you're younger, and again, a part of that going out night scene, you're intrigued by it, and that becomes your anthem, and you want to hear it because it's controversial. So that adds to the impact, definitely. Yeah, all these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats when you're thinking about the impact, innovation, and influence of this particular album. Takes us to dimension 10, the final dimension, the overall timelessness and uniqueness of this album. All right. If you hate 80s music in general, if you hate 80s hip hop, but you can't stand 80s music at all, this album might not sound timeless to you. If you can appreciate the nuance, the ingenuity and newness that was being introduced by taking the best of what came before and stepping into the future, into this electro synth wave and creating something new while still having boom bap sensibilities, then you understand that some of this music lives on. If you think about the actual singles that live on, like Friends, The Freaks Come Out at Night, 5 Minutes of Funk, then it's like, maybe it's not that dated, right? If I'm thinking about people who are still remaking these songs and have made hits that have gone on to last the test of time too, then it's like, if I played If I Ruled the World right now, everybody's gonna bop their head and move to it. It's the same beat. They basically left it untouched. So it's that same Larry Smith production. And you're telling me this is dated? That is your testament there. Something to really think about, because yeah, maybe the inflections, and we'll talk about this in category 2, may sound decidedly 80s. Ecstasy, more than Jalil, has a big 80s sound, just like when, you know. But if for no other reason, sonically, this might save it from being considered a fossilized piece of work. It doesn't sound 40, but it does at the same time. But it still gives the impact of timeless music. And that's something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And on that note, that concludes this category 1 breakdown, review, appreciation, and analysis of the sophomore album by Whodini, Escape. Join us for episode 2, where we go over category 2, which is the rap performance on this album. You already know what it is. Until then, F a Rap Critic. May talk about it while I live it. Word to Meth.